Congress has never allocated as much money as is needed to fund the programs fully. So even in the example that he gave of public housing, which is the only viable program in the city right now that the feds are funding, they don't get full funding for their operating costs. So, and that leads to problems within public housing like deferred maintenance because the housing authority does not get enough money. And in addition, there it has been a prohibition on building new public housing that the federal government imposed starting back with Ronald Reagan.
We'll come back to that in a second. Let's put this broader context. This situation that in New York, such a high percentage of people are paying 50% or more of their income for housing. How does that compare to elsewhere in the country? Is that also happening elsewhere, or is that pretty much unique to New York City?
Well, it doesn't happen as much in other parts of the country that don't have a very high housing costs and where the demand for housing is not as high. So for New York, it's really an unusual situation. And that's why in New York City, there's such a high demand for public housing. New York City's public housing is a real asset and people desire to live in it. And that's shown by the 100,000 families that are on the waiting list. And that's very different from public housing in other areas in the country. The demand isn't as great because people have alternatives.
Now, let's go back a second to this shutting off the spigot, as it were, of funding for public housing, not only for existing public housing, but you said a prohibition against building any new. What was that about? Did that happen kind of just by incremental negligence, or was this in any way a deliberate policy to somehow do away with public housing? I mean, how did that come about?
Yes, that's a deliberate policy set by going back to the Reagan administration, because public housing in the rest of the country is viewed as not a good place to live, not a good place to raise children. The idea was that it's better for families to be integrated into the larger community, and that the view was that public housing residents were all on welfare and didn't work and were isolated from the rest of the community. Now, that's not true in New York City. Most tenants in public housing work, and it's viewed as an affordable place to live for working people.